Hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation about what truly goes on in Rwanda. My name is Denise Zaneza, and it is always my pleasure to be your host on different topics we shall be having regarding the ongoing human rights violations, the oppression, the closed political space in Rwanda, and much more about Paul Kagame's brutal dictatorship. While Paul Kagame's regime is portrayed as a model of success and democracy, the reality is very far from the picture we are used to seeing in the media due to the strong and very expensive PR machine behind the scenes. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of expression are essentially non-existent in modern Rwanda. And this situation is mainly enforced by severe punishment towards any dissenting voice. For a country to fully develop, one needs 4 pillars in a democracy, and these are legislature, executive, judiciary, and the media. In Rwanda, the media is not allowed to be independent. To help us navigate this topic of silencing the media in Rwanda, we are joined by a distinguished guest, Anjan Sundaram. Anjan is an author and journalist who brings remarkable knowledge, value, and insight to today's discussion. Hello, Anjan. Welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Denise. Lovely to be with you.
Before we dive into our conversation, as I do with all my guests, in your own words, who's Anjan Sundaram?
Yes, happy to introduce myself. I'm a journalist and an author, and I've been working as such for the past 20 years, roughly. I began, I studied at Yale. I studied mathematics, and from there I sort of bought a one-way ticket to Congo, Kinshasa, and began my reporting career over there as a stringer for the Associated Press. Stringer is the title of my first book. I then from there moved to Rwanda, where I was teaching a group of about 12 journalists who were taken out by the Rwandan government one by one as I was teaching them. And I wrote a book called Bad News, telling their stories and my journey together with them. And then from Rwanda, I went to the Central African Republic, where I reported on the ethnic cleansing of Muslims by Christian militias, and wrote a book about that called Breakup, which also speaks about my marriage and divorce. And since sort of those 10 years in Central Africa, reporting on dictatorship and conflict, I have then presented a couple of TV shows on India, on artificial intelligence, and subsequently reported on environmental defenders, which is what I'm doing now. I'm doing environmental war reporting on environmental defenders across Latin America. And I gave a TED talk about that topic on TED's main stage this year. I'm involved in now looking at some efforts to support journalists around the world.
Amazing. That is quite a resume. Clearly, your experience and knowledge will be of great contribution today.
Thank you, Denise.
Yes, you're welcome. We have seen countless reports that show how the Rwandan government has targeted and still targets independent journalists and numerous YouTubers who are behind bars on trumped-up charges. Some journalists even get killed. This was the recent case of John Ntwali Williams because he was covering stories that exposed Paul Kagame's dictatorship. And this is all happening like today. But let's go back a couple of years. Like you said, when you went to Congo to learn about journalism, and then you went to Rwanda afterwards to teach about it. What was your experience in Rwanda back then, and when was the first time that you realized that there was something wrong and something strange going on in the country, especially when it comes to journalism?
The first time I realized that, the dynamic between Rwanda and Congo, which is for the last, say, 30 years, has been a dynamic of the Rwandan government destabilizing Congo and fomenting war, especially in the east of Congo. The first time I realized this dynamic was when I was near Goma, and the United Nations was excavating a mass grave. They were building some toilets for their, peacekeeper camp, and they stumbled upon a mass grave. And I rushed to the site. They informed us, all the journalists. I was a stringer freelance journalist for the Associated Press, so they called me. And I remember standing over this pit with many human bones in it. And I from there, began to investigate and understand what has subsequently been detailed in the United Nations mapping report of 2010, I believe,
yes,
which describes how the Rwandan, armed forces under President Paul Kagame teamed up with Congolese rebels and basically swept across the Democratic Republic of Congo, leaving a trail of mass graves in what that United Nations mapping report says could credibly count as crimes of acts of genocide or genocidal killings by the Rwandan government. Yeah. And so that was when I began to realize, that the Rwandan government had a very aggressive and kind of bloody history that wasn't necessarily portrayed in the mainstream media. Then, as you said, I subsequently moved to Rwanda, and when I began to teach the Rwandan journalists, I realized that this class of about 12 journalists that I was teaching were among the bravest and most independent voices in the country, and were facing severe threats. Some of them had already been beaten up, beaten into a coma. Others had been arrested. And then over time, the first sign I had was one of my students dropped out of the class, and I heard him on the radio on a public appearance by Kagame. He asked a question to President Kagame of Rwanda, and his question was so full of flattery and so so praiseful of Kagame, when I knew that in the class he had spoken against Kagame. Then I realized that people are afraid to speak up in Rwanda. People, feel that they must praise President Kagame, praise the Rwandan government. Otherwise, many of them fear that bad things might happen to them. Whether it's their documents not being processed on time, whether there's bank balances, bank accounts being suspended, or land being taken from them, or their children having trouble at school, or, as you said, even up to being killed. Then I realized that, many Rwandan journalists over many years have sacrificed their freedom, their ability to stay in Rwanda, or sometimes their lives, to speak up and hold the Rwandan government accountable. And because many of them are now considered by Kagame to be enemies of the state, you can't really say their names in Rwanda, and so their stories go untold. And that's when, I realized that the experience of my class of about 12 students was an experience that had been lived by many journalists in Rwanda over, ever since 1994, the genocide when Kagame took power, which is now about 30 years ago. And so that's what spurred me to write my book, Bad News, telling the stories of these brave Rwandan journalists, and also countering this narrative that, Rwandans are still traumatized by the genocide of 1994. Therefore, all they want is peace, and they're okay with the dictatorship, and okay with the dictatorship's abuses of power, people disappearing and people being killed. That's not true. Many Rwandans have stood up to the dictatorship in Rwanda. They've, in their ways, tried to protest and speak up and speak out. And many of them have paid the ultimate price. And that's the real story of Rwanda, of the dictatorship that it is, and of the Rwandan people who, like any other population, don't want to live in a place where their family members can disappear, or their land can be taken away from them, or their colleagues can be killed.
Yes, and this is clearly very unfortunate. And you just detailed some of the things that may occur when one speaks up. When you arrived in Rwanda, like you said, you quickly saw the difference between how people would behave in public and how they would behave in private circles, and how those two are very opposite things. Because indeed, out of fear of facing oppression or of being targeted for speaking out on ongoing human rights violations, people don't say what they think in public because the government cannot be held accountable. And anyone who dares to challenge the RPF regime narrative is labeled as enemy of the state, as you said. And unfortunately, many have paid the ultimate price for this. What is more horrific is that this has been going on ever since Kagame took power after the genocide of 1994. And even though he wasn't president yet, but everyone knows, and the records show how he was the one who was pulling the strings ever since. And you mentioned the graves in DRC. I recently had a conversation with Judy River, and we addressed these massacres committed by Paul Kagame's soldiers in DRC, and how really sad and unfortunate it is that the international media never talks about these people who were slaughtered like they weren't human, and that justice is still not on the right side of history. In your book, Anjan, you mentioned some examples of journalists who were targeted and some were killed because of exercising their basic rights and doing their profession as journalists. Could you give us some examples?
Sure. Yeah, I was very um, privileged, I think, because you said earlier that I learned journalism in Congo, and yes, that's true. I learned journalism in Congo as a stringer for the Associated Press, writing articles. I learned the technicalities of journalism, and I began to teach those technicalities in Rwanda to this group of 12 journalists. But I believe that I actually learned what journalism means in Rwanda from those Rwandan journalists who taught me more than anybody else. Even more than they taught me more than my Pulitzer Prize-winning colleagues and mentors, what journalism means, what it means to hold power accountable, even as you and your family are threatened. This is a true function of journalism, to hold power accountable. The other functions of journalism, like entertainment and informing the population, for me, they're secondary. If you don't hold power accountable, then those secondary functions of entertainment and information, they don't really mean very much. And this is the journalist's true function. And I was privileged to meet many such true journalists in Rwanda who saw their colleagues being killed, imprisoned, tortured, and still kept fighting, and kept not fighting with weapons, but fighting with words, kept speaking up and reporting on what the government was doing, on its abuses of power, on its crimes, on how it was harming the population in many cases. So yes, I mean, at the back of my book, Bad News, is a list of about 75 such journalists, and the list is not even complete. Rwandan journalists who were so brave. I'm happy to mention some of their names who I taught in my class. There was worked alongside. There was Jean Bosco Gasasira, who now is in exile I believe in Sweden. There was Agnes Nkusi, who was in prison. She gave me permission to say that she was HIV positive, and while she was in prison, the government would drag her from room to room and not let her sleep, which took an extremely hard toll on her body, given her immune system was low from HIV. There was Jean-Léonard Rugambadje, who was shot dead on the same day he criticized President Paul Kagame. I attended his funeral with his wife, surviving wife, and his child. There was so many journalists from the newspaper Umuseso. I'm blanking on a lot of the names now, but those were some of the names of the journalists
Yes.
whom I taught, and who worked in extremely hard conditions. And for a complete list, of course, you can look at the appendix of my book, Bad News: Last Journalist in a Dictatorship, which lists many of these journalists' names. I'm curious, why are you asking for their names? It's not often that somebody asks me for their actual names.
Because I think it's important to keep on remembering them, and they have carried a light that actually never extinguished, if I can say it like that. Because there are many journalists who came after them who tried also to be independent journalists in the brutal dictatorship that we know. So it is very important to remember their names and to remember their work and a legacy they left behind for others to continue.
Absolutely, and some of the other names are, Didas Gassana, who was the editor of Umuseso. I was at his court case in Kigali. There was Fred Muvunyi, who fled a few years ago, Rwanda, living in Germany. There's Samuel Baker, who fled very recently. And of course, there's John Ntwali Williams, who was killed in a supposed road accident after he had criticized the government. I think it's very important to mention that none of these killings and deaths of journalists have been properly investigated. None of them have even been registered in Rwanda as crimes. And it creates an atmosphere of impunity that the government can do what it wants to journalists and get away with it.
Yes, indeed. That is what they want to create. That is what they have been doing. Like, people are really afraid to speak up. Real journalists are afraid of really becoming independent and doing their work as they should. Because now, for example, the issue is that the oppressed population has no independent journalists to go to. Because most of the journalists right now who are very vocal in Rwanda are in bed with Paul Kagame's regime, and others are afraid to talk, so they don't talk about issues that might anger the regime. For example, just to name a few, we have journalists like Cyuma Niyonsenga, who remains wrongfully detained since November 2021, if I'm not mistaken. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison simply for exposing the poverty in Rwanda, the corruption, the crackdown on government critics, Rwandan soldiers who were raping women, and also some crimes committed by the Rwandan government. So he is in prison since 2021. There's also journalist Théoneste Nsengimana, who's also jailed since 2021. There's journalist and politician Déo Mushayidi, who's also still in prison since 2010. That is 14 years, just because he denounced the human rights violations committed by Paul Kagame's and his RPF regime. So that is 14 years for no crime. It is simply terrible, and it is clear that there's no freedom of press in Rwanda. And my question to you is, for such a country without any freedom of press, what can we expect in the years to come if nothing changes?
It's difficult to predict with certainty, of course, the future. No one knows the future, but what one can point to is, many historical references of similar situations, Rwanda's own history, and using all these facts, one can conclude with some degree of high probability that there will unfortunately be violence in Rwanda's future. And this is a conclusion that, professors, academic experts, historians have come to, people I've spoken to have come to this conclusion because, one, in Rwanda's own history, since independence from Belgium in 1960, there hasn't been a peaceful transition of power. And there has not been a single one. And so there's a good chance that, Kagame's regime will also see a transition accompanied by violence. Number two, we can look at dictatorships in general, and when leaders refuse to hand over power, Kagame has, won his so-called elections with percentages close to 98 to 99%, and which are completely implausible, of course, only enforceable, even if they're true, by force. And we see that historically dictatorships tend to fall and crash suddenly without warning, even though they seem, unbreakable just a short while before. They crash, and usually those crashes are accompanied by revolutions and violence. And unfortunately, we've also seen Kagame just concentrate immense power in himself and his office, increasingly over time. If you look at the election results, he's won elections over time with 93%, 98%, 99%. It's almost as, it's almost like it's a graph of showing the extent of the repression with his, and an indication of his near total power in the country. And he's made a lot of enemies, unfortunately, and people who, as all dictators do. And everyone, even though he seems unassailable and in power, and he may have a great degree of power, it's very difficult to predict when those enemies will see a chance and move in and try to seize power from his hands. And so I think this is a tragic conclusion to make, because Rwandans have unfortunately experienced the violence of the 1994 genocide and the violence that followed that, and
yes, even before 1994, yes.
Yes, before 1994 and 1990, when Kagame's forces invaded Rwanda. And there's just been waves of violence in Rwanda in the 70s and 60s. And so I do believe that this was Kagame's coming to power in 1994 presented a true opportunity for Rwandan society to construct institutions that would guarantee peace. And many Rwandan leaders like Sebarenzi and others who are in exile now had proposed reforms and movement in this direction. Unfortunately, Kagame threatened all of them because he saw them as a threat to his own power, and has, instead of building free and independent institutions that hold his power accountable, like the press, like the judiciary, like a free and functioning parliament, he has turned these institutions into government-controlled entities and really concentrated power in himself. And yeah, when that happens, there's just a strong historical basis for predicting violence. Unfortunately, it's a future that Rwandans don't deserve, but it unfortunately is the one that looks likely.
A very sad perspective of the future, indeed. If nothing changes and if strong institutions aren't put in place in Rwanda, because the reality that we have right now is a recipe for disaster. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like Paul Kagame is ready to open up a political space or get grip of the power that he has consolidated for himself. So we shall see what the future brings. You mentioned that dictatorships never end well and can end abruptly. like you said. So let's hope that there is still a possibility for Rwandans to have a democratic state one day, and through a peaceful transition where innocent Rwandans won't have to suffer again for the mistakes and greed of those in power. Moving forward towards the end of our conversation, Anjan, is there anything Rwandan journalists inside the country and outside of the country can do to change this situation? How does a journalist regain his right to exercise freely when an oppressive regime like Paul Kagame's is in place, and is where the regime is extremely brutal towards any dissenting voices?
I would never say anything is impossible, and I think the brave journalists who've stood up within Rwanda are a testament to the hope and belief that speaking up and words and free speech have in changing a very negative situation.
Mm-hmm.
And there are journalists within Rwanda doing that, and there are journalists outside Rwanda doing that. And honestly, the actual political change in Rwanda will probably result more, will probably be produced, manifest when geopolitical forces or situations make it convenient. That's what happened to the Habyarimana regime in the 90s, and Mobutu in Congo, and many, many other dictatorships. They're convenient for Western powers to support because Western powers have deals with them and get something in return. But at some point, the relationships become inconvenient for sometimes unforeseeable factors, and that will probably drive change in Rwanda, because it's important to say that more than half Rwanda's budget, despite being a dictatorship, is funded by Western democracies who claim to support freedom and democracy and free speech around the world, and yet they fund more than half the budget of a dictatorship in Rwanda. And so the Rwandan government has a lot of propaganda and a lot of messaging around economic growth and innovations and other so-called successes of the Rwandan government, which cannot be verified, which cannot be checked, or it's even dangerous to contradict within Rwanda. But anyway, they produce all this propaganda. But the reality is that they're very much dependent on Western aid, and President Paul Kagame is very much like a puppet government, like a poster child for aid, and at the same time providing important services to Western governments, like sending Rwandan troops to the Central African Republic or Mozambique to help with peacekeeping operations, so Western countries don't need to risk the lives of their own soldiers and citizens. And services like that are very highly valued by Western powers. And in return, Paul Kagame receives a lot of aid. And so, yes, at some point, these calculuses will shift. That always happens. He might pass away, somebody might attack. There might be a shift in priorities for Western nations in Central Africa. And that's historically what's driven a lot of the change. But in the meantime, what helps when that time comes for change, what helps that change be positive, helps it be, lead to the building of institutions instead of another dictator coming in, is the work of journalists, activists, political leaders within Rwanda and outside, who fight for, and advocate for the building of independent institutions, who advocate for, democratic or, even democracy adapted to Rwanda's specific history, but still a situation very far from concentrating power in the hands of one person, like exists in Rwanda today. And so I do believe that, all the small articles and big articles and the activism and the acts and the gatherings and the, discussions within Rwanda and outside do help prepare the country for that moment. No one can predict when that moment will come. but history tells us that it does come. And when that moment comes, I think it would benefit the Rwandan people as a whole to not make a similar choice or to not allow a similar situation to occur as happened in 1994, where Kagame took power and essentially, cemented his power over the next 30 years to what we have today, which is almost a totalitarian government. So yes, I think these acts of resistance build to something, to build to a positive change that's very important.
Yes, that is a very positive note to end our conversation with. Journalists, activists, and opposition politicians must keep on doing the amazing job already being done and not give up, because you never know when all of this will be of use in coming times, I would say. So thank you everyone who has tuned in, and many thanks to our amazing guest, Anjan Sundaram. Anjan, thank you again for being here today.
Thanks so much, Denise. It's a pleasure to speak, and thanks to everyone who is listening.
Thank you, Anjan. To close, let us remember that after the tragedies and resilience that define Rwanda, its people deserve a future led by justice, transparency, and a true commitment to human rights. Paul Kagame's iron grip on Rwanda has cost lives, stifled freedoms, and silenced voices both at home and abroad. Now it is the time for the international community to turn words into action, to step into the right side of history, and to stand for justice and peace in Rwanda, not for the preservation of power under dictatorship. But let us remember, change won't come through silence. As we say in Kinyarwanda, Imana ifasha uwifashije. God helps those who help themselves. So I call on each one of you, everyone who believes in democracy, equality, and rule of law, to refuse complicity through silence. Please raise your voice, stand in solidarity. Let's speak out together against tyranny, against injustice, and against the brutal dictatorship of Paul Kagame. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, let us keep in mind that silence in the face of oppression is itself a form of oppression.